about a bugbear which I have been nurturing for almost 20 years. And I want closure.
Almost
it's
there.
Almost there, yes.
Almost there.
I do a lot of work with developing country and European negotiators, senior negotiators, trust building. Sometimes I feel like, as I was just saying, I feel like the gentil organisateur of Club Med. I sort of bring, because one of the tricks I have to tell you.
Sorry, Professor, can you speak a bit closer to the microphone?
Yes.
Can you hear you?
Okay, can you hear me better now? For those of you who are going to go into the corporate world, networking is everything, and you do networking over nice dinners. That's where things happen, okay? It's not a sandwich in front of your computer. Because that's where you get to know people, and trust is a very personal thing. It is not between governments, it is between negotiators, it is between individuals. But that's one thing I'm doing, but on the side I have been looking into finance for developing countries. And so let me, if those words, right? Yes. I have been working on this topic for many years, and my dear friend Salim Ulhaq, who unfortunately very sadly passed away a few weeks ago, very suddenly, he founded the ECPI with me, and it was a great shock, and I would like to dedicate this presentation to his memory, and there will be things in Dubai. That's us last June. We had a three-place table. Here's another trick. Somebody enters. Everyone has to pass by, and then you pluck them out. That was our office, and it started 20 odd years ago with the Maritime Hotel in Bonn. We used to have a fight with the people from the Global Climate Coalition, who were the oil lobby, about the table, which just meant we had to be there earlier. Okay, so we had our table. So Salim, rest in peace, it was really a great loss. In 2006, it was actually before by a chap called Landau in the French Ministry of Finance under President Chirac, I think it was at the time, but it came into effect. It was that airplane ticket levy. Still going strong. It is elected by the Director of Aviation, but it is not in the budget. There is actually a fund. And that works. Because the moment something enters the budget, it disappears. It becomes part of the sort of things, and sending money abroad is usually not the top priority of parliamentarians anywhere. So the French government actually founded the Solidarity Fund for Development, and money from the levy goes in there. It is administered by the Agence de Développement Française, and the money is earmarked in particular for health issues like Unitaid, which is HIV/AIDS. Originally, it was a surcharge. I think it's good we don't call it levies bad, charges okay. The terminology is very important. Taxes, oh no. But there was a surcharge of €1 on economy flights within Europe, 4 on long-haul flights, and 10 on business class, within 40 long-haul business. Now, the interesting thing is, by 2012, and that's the last information sheet I could get hold of, that's 6 years after it started, it was raising around sort of 170 million euros annually, and he collected over 1 billion over these 6 years, somehow. And the interesting thing here is people always, when you talk about levies like that, ticket levies, won't it have an effect on passenger numbers? No, it didn't have any effect. It is genuinely just a tax, it's a revenue-raising tool. So countries which rely on tourism don't have to worry about this, right? Here, I flew to New York. The ticket cost about £800, and British Airways nowadays very kindly actually disaggregates how this figure comes about. And you can see there was about £200 of these £800 was charges for animal and plant health user fee, right? Which the Department of Agriculture in the US gets to actually check plants and animals when they come in, they immigrate. That's a lot of stuff. So in essence, what I'm trying to show here is most countries already have passenger ticket fees of some form or other. It's not being used for climate change, but they know how to do it. It's very easy. It is, for example, much easier than collecting a carbon tax. Carbon taxes are quite delicate to get good grips. This one, everyone knows. Now, I first started I wrote a paper with Cameron Hepburn, who is a very distinguished economist in Oxford. And we tried to use the French model for an air travel adaptation levy. So for adaptation, not loss and damage. Loss and damage in those days was nowhere on the horizon in terms of being talked about. Adaptation just about came in, okay, the telecom and everything. So 2 years later, we actually got the LDC group to table it in Poznan, but pun intended, it didn't fly. But it was tabled to the ad hoc working group on long-term, what's the LCA, what was that? Long-term. No, LCA, AWC, anyway, it's the thing. It's the thing which came, the Paris Agreement came out of it, I think, whatever. There's a problem which at the time we did not contemplate, which is obvious once you know about it or think about it. The UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement simply have no remit to legislate the aviation sector. Right? Still not. So to dream about a global levy which is decided at the COP or the CMA, it's just fantasy land. All we can do is make recommendations for the sector, which is not good enough to be honest. And the sector in those days, that was about the French levy, was not particularly keen on these issues. And even if they, you can read this, the ECOFIN also said, no, nonsense, we're not going to do this. And even if ICAO now has an emission trading scheme for SIA, if on top of that they were to collect this sort of ticket levy, the chances for the money going to loss and damage are negligible. They would want this to green the aviation sector, right? I mean, there's no. So let's not. Yes, yeah. I mean, naturally. So let's not waste time to think we can come to a global top-down thing. We can talk about it forever. It's a sort of placebo activity, okay? Now, next thing which I did when I realized, well, it didn't work in Poznan, I went like everyone else into bottom-up. And so I designed this sort of corporate air passenger solidarity campaign where basically corporates would put a percentage of their travel budget into the adaptation fund. And the adaptation fund of the UNFCCC, actually Kyoto Protocol at the time, had the advantage of having a donate button. And just a little aside, it's quite funny how these things happen. A friend of mine, Sven Harmeling from German Watch, when the adaptation fund board first met years ago, collected 500 euros in Germany from high school and gave it to the board, the chair of the board, which we owned. The World Bank didn't know what to do with this check for 2 years. Okay? It is not the sort of thing which was acceptable. But to their credit, they got the UN Foundation to introduce a donate button and manage it. And now you can actually donate directly to the adaptation fund as an individual. So there was a good outcome for that. It didn't work. Now, what's the solution? He said in his oath. The solution is take the French model seriously. Make it something which is implemented nationally, but which is led by a group of countries to start with. Right? So adopting is voluntary for countries. It is mandatory for the passengers. It is not something which you do out of charity. You have to pay, but countries are not forced to do it. They can join in. And we have examples here, ticket living, the French solidarity levy. We also looked into other sectors. So remember the key features of these solidarity levies are ease of collection, earmarking of the revenue, so it actually doesn't go into the budget. And we also have, there has been mentioning of the maritime sector. There we have the analog, just have a container charge, $10 per container, right? I mean, it's dead easy. Some countries, like Denmark, are huge in terms of their sort of involvement in shipping. So instead of having the top-down air passenger adaptation levy as a global levy, or the bottom up, you go to the middle. That's what we and Salim, as you can see, proposed just at the beginning of this year, I think it was, and then use it for loss and damage, because the loss and damage fund was introduced in Sharm el-Sheikh, and for us, for me in particular, there are a great danger that this fund would either be a placebo fund, empty, or it will siphon off money from the other multilateral climate funds, which is not desirable either. So we really have to take innovative sources, sources other than budgetary contributions seriously. And I think that message has, it is much more palatable also for developing countries, because developing countries for a long time did not want to talk about innovative sources because they saw this way of the global north of their responsibilities, right? Just shove it off to the private sector, which happens quite a bit sometimes, let's face it, okay? I mean, like the $1 billion goal, which originally was Gordon Brown, and it was public sector funding only, and then Hillary Clinton mix between public sector and private sector, which was the death of it, because no one can decide what the private sector, how it counted. Anyway, I'm digressing here. So, we did a bit of number cranking. If this sort of levy with the same figures as we have for the French solidarity levy would be applied within the EU only, be it the air ticket levy or the container charge, both of them would generate about €1 billion annually. Which is it's never enough, but it's not peanuts. Okay. And also we have to see that a multilateral, of any fund, it's very difficult to spend $1 billion annually. It's not easy. So to me, that would solve the problem. we have a blog here, you can get this, I mean, I'm sure it will be available. This is the sort of the QR code or whatever it is for the piece. You know, I'm so, well. So, as it happens, while writing this piece, I came across a study from July 2021, which the Director General for Taxation, I think, whatever that is, the European Commission commissioned it, looking at taxation of the the air transport sector. And they looked exactly at ticket taxes. And you can see they looked at 10 euros applied to all flights would have a minimal impact on extra European flights, only 1.5% reduction. And the total tax revenue which they said they would generate would be around 7 billion in 2025, so now, and 10 billion in 2050. This is modeling stuff. Again, take these figures with a pinch of salt, but all I'm trying to show here is other people have had the same idea. And I'm not surprised because they're not Einstein. They are very, very straightforward, and that's what we need. So, the French and the Kenyans are working together on a task force, I think is what the thing is, to reform the international financial sectors and to look at different levies and taxes and stuff. Unfortunately for me, I think they're still in the mode of the global taxes. I do not believe global taxes would ever happen. I mean, finance ministries all over the world. This is like loss of fiscal virginity, okay? We do not do global taxes, which is why we have to have a different model. And this model of a leading group of countries just doing it on their own is much more promising because it doesn't have to wait until 2030 or 2050. We can start doing it right next year, basically, and see how much we can raise. And once something is happening, it's much easier for other countries to join in. It's a sort of herd thing. Okay? No one wants to put up their head above the parapet because that's dangerous. The moment there is a coalition or an alliance, as we said, it's Climate Solidarity Alliance, people will join in because they know they have to fund this fund. And it's so much easier to do it through an instrument like this than having to go through domestic appropriations procedures every year. It's difficult to convince parliaments to send money abroad. If it's earmarked flow, which doesn't go through the budget, it's much more easy, automatic. Now, to stop, I want to give you a couple of sort of ideas. These are just my ideas of how this could be operationalized on top of the French model of having easy to collect, earmarked fund. The first thing which we were sort of pushed back on was the sort of the whole thing about common but differentiated responsibilities. Because we think developing countries should join in this. And the way to defend it is this is aimed at the global affluent, I call them. Subsistence farmers in Bihar tend not to fly intercontinental flights. But there are people who can afford it, can afford $5 to give in solidarity to the poor. We will need to have, the fund has to have sort of equitable access. That's a different story. That basically the money gets to the people on the ground, not just into capital. And here is again I was told by a friend who was the State Department finance negotiator many years ago, Paul Bodmer. Do you remember Paul?
Yes.
This idea was actually originally put forward by the Mexicans in their model of the Green Planet Fund. It was just a green fund, right? So basically, how can you make sure that developing countries also want to participate? Well, the first thing is countries do it voluntarily, and they will want to keep some of the money at home to use for loss and damage. And what we are proposing is that one would set some limits. For example, the most vulnerable, LDCs, SIDS, they can use all of it at home. Right? Others could be developing countries between 50 and 100% at home. And developed countries would be allowed to use about up to 25%, and the rest would have to be used to support developing countries, right? Now here comes the nice idea. So, I mean, I know that some small island states are actually already planning to do it on their own. So everyone knows they really need money. And if they can collect it domestically, they know it's going to be there. They don't have to wait for the funds to. But what if we would tell them, if you participate in this scheme, as say an LDC, you're allowed to keep all the money, but whatever money you give to the fund, we will give you twice back. So that's a nice incentive for them to actually participate in the whole scheme. It's a multiplier effect, right? And obviously developed countries wouldn't get anything back if they did. They have to give them funds. So this is the sort of rough sketch of how this might be operationalized. And I think it is really something which has potential because it is fairly, it's not simplistic, but it's simple. It's practical, down to earth. It's what I call pedestrian. It's not the Lamborghini, okay?
It's a 500.
Yes. I like the thing. My mother used to have a 500, but never mind, the old one. So I think this could work. We are trying to get this whole task, the countries participating in this task force, to set up this thing as an immediate thing to do something on the ground, not just talk about how we change the financial world system, architecture in 2050. That doesn't. We want money, and when do we want it? Now. Thank you very much.
That's the young one.
Yes, that's the young girl.
Thank you, Professor Mueller, for this. Let's move on to Federica Fricano, who will tell us what she believes the challenges of the COP at Dubai are.
Yeah, very quickly, because I think the arguments that were introduced by Benito were very interesting. Although I would say if you propose to the government of Italy to put a levy on their ticket, they will say, oh, that's a very good idea. I will put a levy, then we keep the money for doing something else. You know, we have a lot of taxes. Normally they go to the electric bill. And if you look at our electric bill, now there are a lot of taxes we don't even know for what they are used. There are some which are very, very old that belong to the war. And they were never taken away. So it's a good idea, but then you need really to have the government committed to the purpose of that levy. And I hope this task force might.
I will reply later. So
yeah, okay. Okay, I will go very quickly what is going to happen at COP28, which are the context of COP28. Of course, the geopolitical context, which is very, very difficult. The war with Ukraine is still ongoing. Another piece in the Middle East. And so the continuity of energy, of the uncertainty of the energy supply. And at the time I wrote this, China and US were really this opposition and the accusation of unilateral measures from China to the US and from the US from China and even to Europe, I would say, with the carbon border, just tax, whatever it's going to be. But then there was this meeting between between the special envoy Kerry and Sieg, which is the negotiator for China, and it seems things might be smoother a little bit. Let's see what's happened at COP28 on that. And then the incoming presidency, who set the agenda for the COP, and which is mobilizing, I would say, yes, which is mobilizing a lot in terms of communication, but it's really our feeling is that they are a little bit less concentrating on the fact that in any case the COP need to deliver and need to deliver decisions, and you need to create a good space for having a conversation on what the decision should say. And then the legacy from COP27, which was very much concentrated on the loss and damage, but neglecting other issues which for us it's very important, which are mitigation and adaptation, and all over mitigation, since the more you mitigate, the less then you have to adapt, and then the less you have to deal with loss and damage, of course. Although the word is very complicated at this time. And then, of course, the financial issues and the famous 100 billions which were not met in 2020 and which are supposed to be met in 2023, which I think Benito would think these are peanuts. And these are, okay, then the next one, which are the CBDRC, which is something that Benito already mentioned, the common participatory responsibility and respective accountability, which is this principle which belongs, the first part belongs to the convention, then the second part was added to the Paris Agreement. And so the famous historical responsibility, where are we with this historical responsibility, which is something dealing with the emissions, who has emitted in the past and who is emitting now. And as you can see from these you can see on the top the historical CO2 emissions and the situation right now, and the differences that you see there. I think and the one on the left, I think it's very clear what is going on right now. And so why it is so important to involve some countries in this conversation, and also in the conversation of who is financing for loss and damage. So the world is changing. Of course, the historical responsibility remains, but the world is changing, and we need to take care of that. And also the interpretation of equity. What does equity mean? There are very different interpretations of equity in the climate regime. Sorry, I'm going back. This is the financial flow. This is very interesting. It tells you the landscape of climate financial flow that has flown, 1.27 trillion. Where these financial flows are coming, the blue one is public, the red one is it's private, and all the sources. And again, if you see how these financial flows are distributed, very much of those going to mitigation, energy, and very few going to adaptation. Why? Because it's difficult to attract funding for adaptation, while it's much more easier to attract them for mitigation and for energy transformation. Why? Because you can mobilize the private sector, there are interests, there are revenues, and it's much easier than talking about those kind of things than talking about, of course, adaptation. But money are flowing anyway from very variety of sources. But if you look into the details of the financial flow, so if 1.3 are coming for the global as a global climate financial flow, then there is this idea of, well, why these money are not flowing, and the developed countries saying, look, public budget are limited. But then if you look of all the financial flows that are flowing on all the other things like public expenditure in military, fossil fuel subsidies, or at the time of COVID, this is one of the arguments which is frequently used by developing countries. You were able to raise big amount of money in the time of COVID. Why aren't you able to raise that same amount of money for example, loss and damage, or for helping vulnerable developing countries? And that's the reason why then the conversation becomes difficult, because you say, oh well, look, my budget is limited, And then people say, well, yes, when you need it, your budget can be expanded. But this is at the cost of course, of debt, also in developed countries. If you think of Italy, we are, I think, the second large country in the world with regard to debt. Okay, it's very difficult. And then on the other side, you have the climate needs in the different scenario. And the different scenario, of course, really depends on if you are able to cope with climate change or if you are not. And so the loss and damage that might occur because you are not able to stay within the famous 1.5. And this is calculated on the basis of course, of the scientific data. Now the agenda that we have an incredible rich agenda, I would say. We have 5 different agendas for the different institutions, the CMA, the COP, we're still discussing the Kyoto Protocol, which is kind of crazy. We should do something about that. But what are, among these big agendas, what are the main issues that we're going to discuss? The global stocktake, so the famous ambitious cycle of the Paris Agreement, the loss and damage fund, the operationalization of the loss and damage fund, where the money will come from, the global goal on adaptation, the just transition, which is a very brand new thing, which was brought in the agenda by the Egyptian, and where the first discussion are already what just mean, and there are different meanings of just. There is a meaning of just in the Paris Agreement, which is very much linked to the transformation, to the decarbonization and transformation, which of course will affect part of the society, and you need to take care of that, of the social impact of your transformation, and others which interpret it just like we have different pathways, we have different starting points. And then the new financial goal, which is something that it's not going to be discussed this year. It is supposed to be discussed next year as a final decision, but there is a process ongoing on what this new financial goal should be, what the structure should be, where the money should come from, which kind of target should we have, which kind of sources are we going to discuss. So let's stay on the global stocktake, which is the major decision that we should take at COP. And it's a very difficult discussion because it's an important discussion because it's, as I was saying, is that basically should be the mechanism which allow the Paris Agreement to progress in terms of also all over on ambition, because in the Paris Agreement it says that whatever NDC you are going to present, the next round should be a progression compared to the previous one. So if you fail on that, then you fail on the spirit and the very essence of the Paris Agreement. And where are we with that? We are in a very difficult situation right now because we are still discussing. We still have to discuss the form of the decision. In Bonn, we had that discussion and could not even agree on the structure of the decision. It's going to be general recommendation, it's going to be objectives, it's going to be commitment, declaration, targets, not yet discussed. What the decision should cover, basically they should cover mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation, but there is also loss and damage. But also, for example, for developed countries, we should talk about also the third goal of the Paris Agreement, which is the transformation of financial flow, or having loss and damage not as a part of the means of implementation of part of the financial, but as a standalone issue within the decision. Then the scope of the decision. The cycle was meant to inform the next round of NDC, which should be presented by 2025 and should cover the 2030-2040 time period, or 2030-2035, depending whether you have a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan like we have in Europe. But since COP26, we have been discussing we need to stay within the 1.5. And the science tells us that in order to stay within the 1.5, we need to put in place rapid reduction within this decade, so within the 2030. So the decision probably should cover also the 2030. And if we start start talking about covering the pre-2030, of course, developing countries would say, well, but why shouldn't we talk about the pre-2020? Because what was supposed to do, and we didn't do. So you can imagine how difficult is the negotiation. Then the legal reference, whether this decision should be under the Paris Agreement and under the Convention. Why the legal reference is important in the Paris Agreement? Why we do have this discussion? Because under the Convention you have the CBDR. Under the Paris Agreement, you have the CBDR and the LRC, which is common benefit, the responsibility and respective capability. Was the idea not to introduce, was the way to introduce the idea that the world changed sometimes, and those who were, the previous slides, those who were emitting a lot sometimes ago, today might emit less, and there are others who are, contributing to the problem. And then the finance. What should we have on finance in the global stock take, since we already have a discussion on what the future goal for finance should be. And then of course the follow-up, because it's true that the global stock take should inform the next round of NDC, but if we take it seriously and if we decide that the global stock take should also inform the actions that we need to take in place year by year until 2030 in order to stay to the 1.5, then you have to have an accountability framework, because otherwise we will end up with what we had at COP26. At COP26 we had a very nice decision saying that we are supposed to phase down unabated coal. Has anyone did it? Who knows? Well, we know, because in the end we know that China is I think, I don't know how many in their plan, I don't know how many new installations for producing electricity by carbon are they're planning a lot. So you need to, if you set a target, then you need to set a system by which you can assess whether we are doing something. You cannot wait another 5 years, to say, well, we're not there. So the global stock take is meant to be the ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement, and we need to facilitate this course correction on our level of ambition and implementation. A correction, as I was saying, both for the short term, the 1.5 we did reach, but also the long term, the next round and NDC. And all the decisions and the targets and the technical discussion that we had last year around the global stock take should form all the inputs that need to be collected in this decision and need to be transformed in actionable political signal and commitment. And then we need to assure implementation, and all over we need to assure accountability. How to get, as I was saying, we get back each year and check what has been done compared to what we have agreed. And then this was the reality for Benito, because I thought I had a presentation before Benito. This was a comment that was made at the last transitional COP where the loss and damage fund was discussed, because there was this very difficult situation in which you had countries, saying, we need this fund, you developed country, you need to provide funding because you are responsible, because of equity, because of historical responsibility. And actually, one of those people asking for that was Saudi Arabia. And also, I think that one member was so pissed off by being called by Saudi Arabia saying, you caused the problem, and you have to pay. So this was the answer they gave to the person gave to Saudi Arabia, which is, I also think should be part of the conversation, because levy on aviation, levy on maritime, and I know that the problem is, as you were saying, Benito, the difficulty is to have a global understanding, a global agreement. So let's go voluntary, let's go now specific in order to avoid this kind of conversation. But it's also true that those countries, if you think of the levy of the transaction of fossil fuel, how much money we could get, for the loss and damage. But the conversation then ends with this. It's very difficult. That's why we asked the presidency, why don't you start? And make a voluntary contribution to loss and damage would be a very good political signal, no? I say we take it seriously, and we take also the principle of, you know, the polluter pay principle, and maybe others will follow, no? But maybe this is a dream.
Okay, thank you very much. Federica. Now, let's go on to Giacomo Di Capua. Please help us conclude after these two great talks.
No pressure.
No pressure. Absolutely. Exactly. First of all, thank you very much all for being here. It's a really great pleasure for me to come back here as a proud alumnus of this institution and deliver closing remarks to this fantastic lecture. I think we have heard a lot of interesting remarks about how a lot of insurmountable challenges, seemingly insurmountable challenges, remain in the path that we are charting towards fighting climate change. And thanks again for the organizer for creating this space, as it has been a tradition now for 3 years that within John Cabot University there are emerging conversations on issues related to the Conference of the Parties, to the UNFCCC. Today I'm addressing you in my capacity as official youth delegate of Italy. Oh yes, sorry. So today I'm talking in the capacity of official youth delegate of Italy to the United Nations, which means I'm going to try to sum up what are some of the emerging aspirations also on the side of youth advocates. For the past couple of months, my colleague Napolitano and I have been in New York. We have joined the Italian delegation to the 78th session of the General Assembly. And we have also had the incredible honor of negotiating 3 resolutions ourselves in terms of social development and human rights. And the conversations on social development and human rights are actually quite useful to try to unpack the great complexity that lies ahead of COP28. So, of course, we only have 180 hours before the official start, the official ceremony of COP28, which is a dauntingly little time to prepare and try to increase our capacity as we approach this conference. I would just like to leave you with 3 key messages that are emerging from the Global Youth Statement and also from some of the concepts that we heard today from these amazing speakers. The first one is that ambition, more ambition, is not only needed, but is urgent and quintessential to try to safeguard both human and ecological welfare. And this idea that more ambition is needed was highlighted in numerous documents. The United Nations Environmental Programme actually released a couple of key documents ahead of the Conference of the Parties. And the financial needs of developing countries today are 10 to 18 times larger than the existing public finance flows for climate adaptation, which leaves us with this incredible gap to fill. The other problematic aspect is, of course, aspiration with regards to mitigation, which was already mentioned. This year, there will be this institutional space for reflection, the global stocktake, to try to see how this architecture has or has not been delivering on a number of key aspects. And of course, the report that was released last week indicates that the current national action plans do not pave a way towards a world with 1.5 degrees in increased temperatures, which of course leaves us on a pathway that does not fulfill what we call the Paris Promise. However, COP28 can provide some space to try and see where this ambition might come from. The global stocktake, but also non-negotiated initiatives have a glimmer of potential in this regard. The second aspect that for global youth has been particularly important is climate justice. And the conversations on loss and damage that were enshrined in the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan of last year actually revived a lot of conversations regarding climate justice, what kind of form climate justice takes within the negotiations on climate policy. And on the one hand, there is a positive signal. The Transitional Committee that was tasked to develop some recommendations for the final decision on COP28 regarding loss and damage, was able to reach consensus, although there are still controversies on the contents and modalities. There is still that positive aspect to consider. Definitely exploring innovative sources for financing is necessary to bridge that political divide and make sure that we can proceed despite divergences and geopolitical tensions. On the other hand, we have seen that especially young plaintiffs are bringing the issue of climate justice to domestic and regional courts, which is a very interesting latest development. The connection between what are concrete losses and damages at the domestic, local, and regional level have been brought before courts in connection to human rights. And although it's an emerging trend, this connection between safeguarding human rights in case law, in international jurisdiction, has been solidifying over the past 10 years. And the last key message I wanted to leave you with is actually more of a provocation. And I'm borrowing this from a great climate advocate, Mary Robinson, former Irish president. And she always asks one question: what if the best days are ahead of us? Before this insurmountable amount of challenges, both technical and political, it seems quite natural that a lot of youth advocates that are in this space might seem discouraged, might disengage from that conversation. Yet the global youth has shown that there is an impervious face to humanity, an incredible capability to mobilize, and an incredible capacity also for advocacy. So again, perhaps it is high time that we leverage this energy in a particularly crucial time of climate negotiations. Including young people in decision-making in national delegations is the way forward to make sure that we advance ambition, pursue equity, and also ensure representation in policymaking. It is for this very reason that back in New York we advocated for the inclusion of the recognition or the explicit recognition of the role of young people in what, as of last Thursday, was adopted as the resolution on policies and programs involving youth, and also encouraging member states to include young people in national delegations. So in conclusion, we have 180 hours that separate us from the beginning of the 28th edition of the Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC. As youth delegates, we will be there. We believe in our ability to build capacity among youth, to support Italian youth, but also internationally, and also continuing our mission of advancing global priorities for young people. And most importantly, we believe in a multilateral system that doesn't only work with young people, but works for young people. The younger generations are going to be the ones that bear the full consequences of the climate change in their lifespans. So it's high time that youth is at the center of the process itself. Thank you again for your powerful speeches, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. What better place to end on a note like that, empowering the youth, than in the university, right? Right, so we are at John Cabot, and as I was saying before, the reason for this meeting actually stems from the desire to prepare our COP delegates better before attending COP. And so now I turn to them, and I will leave them the microphone to see what questions our COP delegates have on the basis of what they've heard. And just to introduce our COP delegation very briefly. So there were 4 students who were selected to be part of the COP delegation. We have Lynch, who is a student from Italy. Chloe is from the United States. Manuela is Brazilian, and Betsy is from Ethiopia. So we have this group represents very much John Cabot student body. We are a student body from students from 75 countries. We are the most international undergraduate program in Italy. And I'm very interested in hearing now what these 4 students have and what they would like to ask you. So I will leave them the microphone now, which is right there. And I will reach out.
Thank you very much for this insightful forum, and Giacomo, thank you for your closing. I think highlighting the youth is super important, and I think we all resonate with what you shared today. So I have one question that I was thinking about, reflecting also So how do we ensure that this loss and damage fund is not a repetition, but instead an integrated effort with other pre-existing measures, and how in integrating it do we enhance the overall effectiveness of it? And as we brought up discussions of human rights and other aspects that tie into this, yet I was thinking, what does it mean also that these aspects, human rights, governance, corruption, what does that mean? How does that tie into this loss and damage fund? If the governments are supportive, if certain bodies are supposed to earmark this finance, this money that comes in, how do we ensure that it goes back out? How do we ensure that whatever is earmarked is correct? Because personally, coming from a country that I know has had a long history of corruption, I question. I'm like, okay, so I'll take this to my government, and then what do they do? Obviously, these are very big questions, but just, I don't know, bringing it forward.
Let's do one at a time. Okay?
Big question.
Thank you. Yes. And the way the fund integrates into the general, is it okay if I come? Yes, there you go. In the loss and damage funding arrangements and things. The one thing which I think we need to be clear about is that this fund, in my mind, is going to be relatively small in comparison to the arrangements. I do not see this as a $1 trillion fund. Okay? I think the purpose of this fund should be to pilot things, new ways of addressing loss and damage, new types of insurance schemes. In many cases, countries are actually underinsured as it stands because the private sector wouldn't touch them. So how can this fund would help these countries to become insurable, for example? That would be the sort of thing which I see, because ultimately the money in this context, insurance lies with the private sector. That's where they would. But if they don't go to your countries because you don't have the whatever mappings, risk mappings and all that, that's one thing the fund can do. In terms of human rights, I'm not an expert, but in terms of how can you ensure that the money actually reaches those most vulnerable and poorest impacted, that's relatively straightforward. I was involved in developing this idea of enhanced direct access, which basically means that a fund, we have it to an extent in the adaptation fund and a little bit in the green climate fund. When you devolve funding decision to the lowest possible level. So what we are trying to avoid is that every single funding decision, every project is approved at the board level. That's just nonsense. Okay? I mean, when we designed the green climate fund, there was a meeting in New Delhi. And the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FICCI, gave a presentation in which they said, look, it was about mitigation. Our members, 50,000, I don't know, large, India, large money, they are not in the habit of writing project proposals to go to Sondo in Korea. They don't even write project proposals to go to Delhi. The people they write project proposals for is their local banks, right, for loan and stuff like that. So if you want to make sure that the money trickles down properly, you have to use these existing mechanisms. Banks, local district councils. There was actually a World Bank program in Indonesia. They have 11,000 districts, which gave each district annually $30,000. And the district council then had competition amongst the villages. It wasn't climate, it was development. But basically, so to make sure that in many cases it's the people on the ground who know best how to use the money. There will be corruption, But you know, if a mini project is corrupt, it's not the same as if a huge sort of. And also, particularly loss and damage, also adaptation, there is never enough money to protect everyone from everything. The crucial question is not who do we protect from what, but the crucial question is who do we not protect from what. And in that question, the whos should be involved in deciding that they are not protected. It shouldn't be done at the provincial level or at the national level or, lo and behold, at the international level. This is a decision which the people on the ground have. We decide not to be protected from this thing. So these are ways in which you can make sure that, as I said, I don't know about human rights, but in terms of getting the voice of the people on the ground, it is literally giving them a chance to be involved in the funding decisions. What is to be funded and what not. Thank you.
Okay, so my question was actually pretty much related to what Betsy was talking about. I've been very interested in trying to understand this process of allocating sources, revenues, mostly in terms of development. But I think I would try to take another approach and ask something different, not focus on loss and damage. But I wanted to ask your opinion on the participation of so many institutions and people that represent fossil fuels into this conference. So moving away from loss and damage, how do you see the positioning of people such as the president of COP itself represented in the conference that is supposed to approach and talk about climate and how to move away from fossil fuels?
Well, these questions, it's the same question we've been asking since we have the COP president, which is also the CEO of the major, of the country producing oil producing company of the Emirates. You know, of course, you can look at these issues like, oh, why these people should be there, and why these people should be the one, leading this process, huh? Because they have an interest. But everybody has an interest in this process, not only them. And if you don't keep them into the discussion, then it's very difficult, to come to the core of the discussion. They are the problem, but they also need to be part of the solution. Otherwise, you will never be able to impose something on the companies or on oil-producing countries or on the people. So they really need to be part of the discussion. And if you think of even Sultano, who is the president of the COP, if you listen to his speeches at the beginning when they started this journey, and then you listen to his speeches now, things have changed. So he probably has learned a bit, because it was very much criticized at the beginning, why he didn't resign from being the CEO of the oil-producing company of his oil countries. So he started talking about emissions, and things need to be done, but then he finished talking about the real problem, which is fossil fuel. Of course, he hasn't changed position because his country lives on producing oil. But he's being involved in the discussion, he's been listening, and I think that this is much better than having them in a nasal and not talking or not participating. And this is also with regard to all the other people that are participating to COPs. We have representatives from many oil-producing companies participating to the COP. But I still think, I know it's difficult, but I still think that it's better to have them in than having them out. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yes, if I may, but we also have to realize that we are in a different ballgame now. We are no longer negotiating a treaty, particularly one like the Kyoto Protocol, which had legally binding obligations. that's when these lobby groups actually came in and tried to change the very nature of these obligations. Now we're just taking, the negotiations are meant to be very pedestrian and just taking stock. And they don't, I mean, the oil companies don't give a hoot about taking stock. Right? I mean, it's just not. So, I mean, there are many lobbyists, I'm sure, there because there's so many more people there in the first place. But I do not think that they have a bigger influence than they used to have at the beginning of the process when we negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. They are really, it's a different game. So I wouldn't be too worried about, and yes, and we need to bring them in, we need to, I mean, even with the UAE, yes, I think they're genuinely trying to do something within their limitations, okay, there's no doubt. So I'm not, okay, we shouldn't have just oil-producing countries being co-presidencies and sort of 4 or 5 secret, but by and large, I think it's a positive thing that they actually chose to do this, and they're spending an enormous amount of money on this COP, okay? So the fact that they have come out and influence, if also, I think they decided not to have a covered decision, it's going to be the stock take decision, which is already a good thing. The covered decisions used to absorb presidencies, right? That's all they thought about. The Glasgow Pact and all that sort of stuff, it had to have their name in it and things. The moment you subtract this from the presidencies are not meant to prescribe policies, they're meant to sort of facilitate the process. But if you give them a covered decision to negotiate, that's all they want to do. They want to have the daily mandate and whatnot, okay? So it's getting better, I think. So don't worry too much.
Nice and loud, much louder.
My question relates back to the loss and damage fund. I was wondering how.
No, it's okay.
You have to speak louder because there's an interpreter who needs to hear it.
Sorry, I was just wondering how the distribution of funds would be determined for the loss and damage fund, and is there any specific criteria for one country that is experiencing the detrimental effects of climate change to get more money than another struggling country, or how is that decided yet?
No, I don't think it has been decided yet. I mean, look, at the moment, the Green Climate Fund, which has been working for quite a while, it basically says it's eligible for developing countries, but no one knows who that is. So we managed to work these funds with sort of constructive ambiguity. Right? I mean, if Italy were to approach the Green Climate Fund for funding, for an Italian proposal, I think the other EU countries would say, yeah, think again. But it's a sort of self-regulating thing. What might happen is that the board, which is going to be elected, comes up with certain portion, certain things, so much for insurance, so much for reconstruction. Like we have in the GCF, we have 50-50 adaptation, mitigation, that type of stuff. I don't think there is necessarily going to be a sort of a country allocation for the simple reason that we don't actually know exactly which countries are meant to be developing countries. So I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. But the answer is no. The short one. We haven't got the...
Well, in reality, for example, from our side, and I'm talking as country of the EU, when we start discussing these issues of the lost and damage, we try to tie the lost and damage fund to the most vulnerable. But then the problem was, okay, what do you mean by vulnerable? No? There are different indicators that you can use in order to understand why a country might be vulnerable. I mean, a rich country is vulnerable to loss and damage, of course. No? It depends on what indicators you take. But the idea behind it was not to have basically big country, using these funds, but prioritize at least developed countries, so countries who has not the ability to cope with loss and damage with their own budget or with their own capability. So we've been discussing within the EU, how to operationalize this concept of vulnerability, and it was very, very difficult. So at the end, I think in the decision there is something which says that there will be a certain amount of money which will be dedicated to the most vulnerable. But then it will be, in the operationalization of the fund, we will need to find out what vulnerable means. And this was done because, of course, there was the worry of other countries, like, for example, Pakistan during the negotiation intervening and saying, why you want to talk about vulnerable? Who are the vulnerable countries? What do you mean by this? It means that us, a country that was hit last year by a major flood, which causes major damage, would be able to access these funds. So it should be dedicated to the countries that are most in need, and avoid countries that have the ability to cope with loss and damage to access these funds. But it's very, very difficult indeed to design this kind of ratio.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then my last question would be, what do you think are the actions that should actually be taken in order to achieve these goals? Because as previously mentioned, we had good results in COP26, and also in COP27, we finished with the loss of damage found, we had great results, but as you said as well, financing is not enough. So what do you think should be the extra effort that countries and also all these institutions should take in COP28 in order to actually make these actions work for, of course, 2024, and then the time framework we were talking about before, about 10 years or 20 years, depending on.
Who wants to answer this?
Well, of course, our expectation for COP28 is that we will not have a common decision, but at the end I think that the global stocktake will be in any way a common decision, because there will be, of course, part of the decision which will be dedicated to adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementation. But I think there will be an overall chapeau which says, what are we doing? I mean, once we recognize that we are not there, that we are not, reaching the goal of the Paris Agreement. We are not even in the trajectory reach that. We are in the trajectory, but we are still very, very, very far. What can we do? So our expectation would be to have some, decisions in terms of commitment of doing something. Like, for example, the tripling, the global goal for tripling renewable, the global goal for doubling energy efficiency, and even mentioning of the fossil fuel phase out, which I think would, if they will be there, it would be unabated fossil fuel. I don't think fossil fuel simply will be there. But then again, as I was saying before, this is a nice to have, but the problem again would be, okay, how are we going to assess that what we are saying today, I mean, people will celebrate if we're going to have these kind of things in the decision at the end. But then the day after, you will have to think, okay, how are we going to account for that? How are we going to, assess whether countries are doing exactly what they pretend to believe in at the end? It's always very, very difficult. But we try anyway.
Is there anybody from the audience who has a question? Yes.
Thank you. I had a question. I was reading, Dr. Mueller, I was reading a paper that you wrote. You said something along the lines of less ambition may be more promising. You said this specifically about the adaptation protocol that was proposed by India, but I wanted to kind of unpack this, because then Giacomo said that ambition is needed, and I think that ambition is kind of counterintuitive, or less ambition is counterintuitive counterintuitive when we think of COP. I'm wondering, is it too ambitious? I mean, I've been to COP26 and I saw that a lot of, maybe one word to replace ambition could be intangible. There were a lot of things that were proposed, the 1.5, that seemed very intangible, almost too ambitious. And I think a lot of young people were kind of countering this by creating more open dialogues. So kind of meeting people in the middle, which is what you were talking about in your speech. And I'm wondering whether this is something that you all notice about these kind of conferences. Is it too ambitious? Is it too intangible? And also a follow-up question specifically for Giacomo is when I think of climate change and I think of a way to make it more tangible, for me the first word that comes to mind is indigenous. Because the indigenous, although they're part of 6% of the population, they possess 80% of the world's biodiversity, if not more. I'm wondering, is this something that comes up in your talks, in your discussions? And do you think this could make solutions more tangible if we give them more representation?
I have written so many things. I don't recall what I wrote, but I will say something anyway, okay? But thank you for reading it. One of the problems is that ambition is becoming just a slogan, which we really don't. Usually it's in terms of mitigation, but then we use it for adaptation stuff, and I'm getting a bit sort of edgy about this. Right now, my main goal, beyond finance, is to be absolutely clear most countries, if not all countries, will have to deal with climate change on their own. Right? The idea that we're going to have, look, these COVID financing, those were not international flows. This was money raised to be used domestically, and so it's a bogus argument that we could raise this. The international flows are important, we need to show solidarity, but we also, I think, need to show countries how they can help themselves. I'll give you an example. In India, where I have connections, I'm an overseas citizen of India, believe it or not. They have had a program called Tutela, which was a program where the federal government, the central government decided to sell LED bulbs to the poor.
To sell, sorry?
LED.
LED.
Yes.
Yeah.
And everyone thought it was utterly mad. They were 10 times as expensive as ordinary incandescent. What did they do? They made bulk procurement. They made a call for tender, 750 million bulbs. And the price collapsed to 1/10 of the market price. And then you can sell to the poor. And what I've been pushing, for example, in the Caribbean, CARICOM, if individual small island states are very small, they don't have the financial muscle of the government of India. But if they all join up, they can make a call for electric vehicles or something where you can use market forces to achieve technology transfer. For example, that's just an example. Instead of just talking about multilateral or international flows of grants and stuff, which are important, I'm not trying to, but also show how things can be done. With these aviation levies, every country can collect them by themselves, from foreign nationals, from their own rich people. This is the sort of concrete stuff which I think we need to focus much more on to help countries to help themselves in a way. So that might be this. But I haven't answered the question because I haven't really understood it.
Regarding the second part, so the involvement or even emergence, say, of indigenous stakeholders in the climate negotiations, I've been following that more, again, as an observer, and the peculiar aspect that really comes up is, first of all, especially in the last 7 COPs, the number of civil participation has increased as a whole, which means also there is a little bit more structuring and mobilization for indigenous stakeholders and requests. Also, if you do like a word analysis of the cover decisions, you will see that the references to indigenous peoples are increasing over time. Now, does that mean that there is an actual strengthened voice for indigenous people within the climate legislation process? Their actual conversation goes back to just the status of indigenous people vis-a-vis climate change. The state of the Arctic is particularly interesting because there, of course, nation states and boundaries do not coincide with member states. So the capability of indigenous people to advocate when member states are negotiating is of course reduced if there is a cross-boundary dimension to identity. And of course the Arctic Council provides a kind of interesting point of reflection, because when they're doing decision making, including on one of the 6 priorities of the Norwegian presidency that is incoming for 2023, they have 6 permanent participants. There are 6 indigenous associations. They don't have a right to vote, but they are permanently there, and they have a right to present proposals and be consulted, which goes back to the idea of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, that there is a right to consultation and there is a right to land. Of course, climate change is deeply affecting and threatening that kind of welfare, and given that member states are in a symmetry that does not coincide with the abilities of young people to consult internally before doing external advocacy, I think that there is a little bit of disconnect there. Hopefully there will be some action-oriented proposals in that regard, but I haven't been aware of any specific measures.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have a question?
There's one in the back there.
Yes. So I said yes, all the way to the back.
I have a question for Professor.
Could you speak up?
Sure. I have a question for especially Professor Mueller, so do you know of any mechanism that will be applied in the loss and damage fund that will make sure that the projects will guarantee the sustainability of the project in terms that when the project is done, is finished, things will still be working in the area where the funding has been given, or in more general case, whether there are mechanisms that public policy will be possibly implemented with these funds in the terms that they are sustainable. I mean, this intervention is sustainable. You know? Because as in mitigation or adaptation, and in this case, things have to last longer than the duration of the project, right? So,
Right, I mean, the short answer is no. But I can give you a longer one, slightly more interesting. As I said, this district development program of the World Bank in Indonesia was actually such a success that the Indonesian government took it over afterwards, in terms of a way for fiscal transfers, how they domestically implement fiscal transfers. In India, there's the NREGA, it's an employment guarantee scheme where poor people, rural poor people, have the right of so many days employment paid through the central government. And the money goes from the central government to the state government, the provincial government, and then the local. And the interesting thing there is, okay, so I'm a poor guy, I have a right to, 100 days employment at a certain rate, cheap. But who decides what I'm going to do? And at the end, it's actually decided at the village level which work will be done through this scheme. And I think this is very important. And also what's happening in India right now, I'm told, is that they're now using the same mechanism for adaptation funding. The add-on adaptation. But the fiscal transfer and the whole social audit, in the NREGA scheme, they do have social audits, which is NGOs who service as audit at the local level. So all these things can happen, and once it becomes part of the governance structure, it is sustainable as much as it possibly could be. Okay, I mean, okay, so you could have a war and the government disintegrates, but by and large, once it's part of the fiscal system and structures, it will be sustainable. That make sense?
Yes, yes. It makes sense.
Anyone else? Nobody else? Okay, well, thank you very much, Benito, Federica, and Giacomo, for this really enlightening, very thought-provoking discussion. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thank you for